Welcome to this EBA seminar on fishing aid, and I'm Torgny Holmgren. I'm a member of the expert group on aid studies. And before going into the study itself, maybe I should mention a few words about EBA. EBA, what is that? That's the expert group on aid studies. It's formally a kind of standing committee under the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden, inaugurated in 2013, but I could go back even to 2001 and 2002 when there was a parliamentary commission come forward with a new Swedish policy for global development, and that commission proposed to, well, we should establish a freestanding evaluation unit in Sweden on aid delivery. The parliament endorsed that and even wrote to the government that there should be in Sweden an independent aid evaluation body. Over the years there have been some different functions of that, but since 2013 this is the body, the EBA. And EBA, even if it's a committee under the Foreign Affairs Ministry, it has a kind of double independence in the way that we commission work. The first degree of independence is that the committee itself decides on which studies to be undertaken and also have a quality check of the studies also for publication. The second degree of independence is that the reports, as you will find today, is the report of the authors. So the authors are both the most owners of the recommendations and also the analysis in the reports, even if it's an EBA name. So that is a double degree or standard of independence. And over the years, I think in every report you will find, yes, and pages, all the reports that have been published. And I will come back at the end of this seminar also to state when we will have the next report being issued and also the next seminar. Well, the idea behind EBA is to bridge the gap between research, policy and practice. And of course we do approach Swedish audience, but not only Swedish, I will say, but also international audience interested in aid and development issues. And over the years we have covered a lot of ground, from democracy, human rights, international finance institutions, country-based studies, etc. Today we are looking into a specific area of aid that has been around since 80s, or at least 40, 50 years. And that is the fishing aid. And the title of this study, this is wrong study. This is Fish Stocks and Aid Flows, Poverty Reduction in Times of Resource Depletion. No, it's not. That was something else. Fishing aid. Sorry. Mapping and synthesizing evidence in support of SDG 14 Fisheries Targets. As you know, all the SDGs have number of targets, 169 targets, and a number of targets under the SDG 14 under C kind of SDG. And this is specifically looking into the fishery sector or fishing sector. And I find it, as I've been also chairing the reference group, giving kind of advice and also support to the team of authors. I've been dealing with aid for quite some time, but I was astonished when I learned about what we have succeeded and not succeeded in when it comes to fisheries aid. And that we will learn more about just in a moment. So we will start off with the authors of the report, or some of the authors will present the report. Then we have another intervention from Desai. If technology works, he will be on video link. And after that, I will invite two of our colleagues around today to comment upon the report and also give their views, kind of panel discussion. And then I open up for all of us to take part in this discussion. We have plenty of time. I think we have rented this up to midnight, no, to 4 p.m. So if you, I think there are still coffee, I hope, and water, etc. outside. So if you want to bring that along. And one technical aspect to finalize my introduction is when you take the floor eventually, take a mic, because then audience outside this room can also get what you would like to state. Now, having said that, I would like to introduce Raphaëlle Bisiaux. You're a senior consultant at NIRAS, and you have been co-authoring this book or this study together with Goncalo Carneiro who eventually also will take the stage in the presentation report. And you are currently, well, from a few months, senior analyst at the Swedish Agency for Marine Water and Marine Resources. Yes, but you started off this study as a consultant at NIRAS as well. So, Raphaëlle, please, the floor is yours. Mute. Technology.
Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Raphaëlle Bisiaux, and I'm happy to be here to present our study about what works and what doesn't work in fisheries and fishing aid. So, this study was undertaken by, it was a joint undertaking between HAVS, so the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, the Fisheries Training Program based in Iceland, and NIRAS, a consulting firm based in Stockholm. So we were a team of 4, so 2 of us today are going to present, and there's another 2 in the audience as well who are here and came all the way from Iceland and who will be able to answer questions as well. Goncalo was the lead author for the study. Mary Frances and myself supported the research, and Tumi was an advisor with a quality assurance role. So in the 20 minutes that we have ahead of us, we'll first cover the aim and the scope of the study, including the methodology used. And second, we'll focus on the results of the evidence mapping, so what evidence is out there. And then on the results of the thematic synthesis, so what is the evidence out there actually telling us. And it's important to note that this presentation is a presentation of selected results, focusing on the issue of the dilemma in fisheries aid, which is the topic of this seminar. But if you want to hear more about the full study, I would refer you to the actual report. So the main reason for this study is a question that we asked ourselves. What can we learn from aid to the fisheries sector that could help design interventions in the future related to achieving SDG 14 targets? Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the SDG targets related to fisheries, there are 4 targets that broadly relate to, first, effectively regulating harvesting and ending overfishing. Second, ending subsidies which contribute to overfishing. Third, increasing the economic benefits from sustainable management of marine resources. And fourth, providing access of small-scale fishers to resources and to markets. And to find out which interventions actually could help reach these targets, we divided our study into 2 different stages. So first, finding out which evidence is available, mapping the evidence, and second, actually synthesizing the evidence that we find. So in terms of methods, we started off with a systematic search of evaluation reports in various databases. And it's important to note that this study is a synthesis of results coming from evaluations that have been published and that are available online in a number of selected languages. So our study is actually not necessarily representative of all aid to fisheries. First, because some of the interventions actually are not evaluated. Second, because some of the evaluations are not published. And third, because some evaluation reports we found were in Japanese or Chinese, and we're not able to include these in our study due to limitation of language skills of our team. But after searching the databases, we screened the studies that we found and selected those relevant to our topic. And we then proceeded to actually extracting the relevant information and analyzing it and writing the report. So what did we find out is actually available in terms of evidence? Well, so our research led to the identification of about 5,000 documents related to using search terms that were related to fisheries aid. And we did a first screening of the documents available by simply looking at the titles and the abstracts, and we retained about a bit less than 300 documents. We then did a full text review of those documents that led to the elimination of like a few other irrelevant studies, and we ended up with 244 studies in our sample. Then, based on the size of our team and the time that we had to conduct the study, we picked a representative sample of 123 studies from the 244 studies that we read thoroughly and analyzed the content of. And for this task, this last step, we actually use a qualitative analysis software called Atlas TI. Now, in terms of the geographical distribution of the evidence, it's actually quite varied. So this map shows you in blue the dots about interventions taking place in one country only. So one dot equals one study. In green, the studies about interventions taking place in one country, but with more than one study. So the number on the dot actually indicates the number of studies in that country. And in yellow, so here and in a few other places, you've got studies of global and regional interventions. And what's interesting here is that Eastern Africa stands out as the region with the largest number of studies, with about 46 studies in Eastern Africa, followed by Western Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia, all of which have about 30 studies each. And finally, there's 23 studies of global intervention in the evidence that we've mapped out here. So one can say that the greater focus on Africa and parts of Asia is actually consistent with the fact that they receive the largest share of ODA, overseas development assistance, in the fisheries sector. Now, in terms of the SDG targets that these studies talk about and the evolution of this over time, we can see on these graphs that from the 1970s, from the 1970s until now, the focus on management-related interventions, or like interventions related to regulating harvesting, has actually increased. So this is the bar graphs that you can see in red, while the focus on production-oriented interventions, so interventions related to increasing economic benefits, has actually decreased. So that's the purple line that you can see here. And this is good for us in terms of the validity of our sample, because this actually corroborates other studies on the evolution of aid to fisheries and ocean-related matters, and the fact that there is more focus on management and regulating harvesting than there is on increasing economic benefits. Finally, an interesting aspect of this evidence mapping exercise is that only about 20% of the evaluations that we found are ex post evaluations, meaning that they take place at the end, after the end of the intervention that's being evaluated. And this is a bit of a problem for us because it actually lessens our ability to say something about the longer-term effects of fisheries aid. And it's actually related to the more sort of widespread evaluation practices that tend to focus on evaluating interventions during the implementation. Nothing wrong with that, but that's definitely a limitation for our study. And now, for these studies actually taking place after the end of the intervention, we are talking about an average of 3 years between the end of the intervention and the date of the publication of the study. So that's the graph you have here. So again, we definitely didn't capture much evidence in relation to long-term effects, nor did we find many studies that actually quantified the effect sizes of the changes observed. And with all these limitations in mind, I'll let Goncalo tell you more about the actual findings of the synthesis.
Jag har hittat dem.
Okay. Thank you, Raphaëlle. I'll just quickly go through some or a selection of the results, and as Raphaëlle said, that more directly address the issue of this seminar. So how do we how do we increase or how we improve livelihoods from fishing, or how can aid play a role in improving livelihoods from fishing in a time where there's an urgent press towards conserving the resources. And I'll go through some of the... So the first set of results we've seen is that, or where we've seen a strongest set of evidence regarding to positive income gains is in studies relating to interventions for post-harvest processes, be it marketing, be it storage, handling of fish. And that's where we also have the largest number of studies with some effect measurements, where they measure how much the incomes grew or changed with the intervention. However, there's most of the studies actually don't do any effect size estimations. So our conclusion is, or one thing we point out, there's a need to understand better what are the mechanisms that enable or that lead people to, or communities to, earn more from better post-harvest processing or post-harvest processes. And how large are those gains? There's a few examples of interventions that claim that there are improvements in income or improved livelihoods from increased catches, mostly related to or attributed to improvements in management of fisheries. So you manage the fisheries better, and you enable people to earn more from that. But we didn't find any case with any estimation of effect size. So the issue, again, needs further study. And then the issue of distributional effects. Typically, if you improve management, you improve control, you keep some people out of the fisheries, what happens to those? So that issue is insufficiently discussed. There's quite a few studies relating to, for example, improving marketing skills or marketing infrastructure and infrastructure for accessing export markets. There's quite some focus from donors on that. There's very little discussion on effects that might have, for example, for the supply of fish to the domestic markets, in particular to poorer parts of the population. There's only a couple of studies that take up that issue. Still on the issue of how do we improve livelihoods through fisheries? One of the issues, and that is a very topical one with regards at least to small-scale fisheries, is access to resources. What we found is in most studies addressing this issue, and there's actually relatively few studies dealing with the issue of access to resources. Where those exist, it's what we termed sort of facilitating and securing controlled access. So you restrict access to some, you enable access to others, and interventions put in place some mechanism to regulate that access and the harvesting. Of those studies, only one estimates effect size. So be it in terms of income or in terms of harvesting, or the status of the resource. So we can't really say, are these mechanisms, is the introduction, for example, of tenure rights, is it improving the sustainability of fisheries? We can't really say that from the sample. There's recognition, and there's and that's also in line with, for example, the FAO guidelines on small-scale fisheries, the importance of devolving governance to the local level, not least for the sake of acceptance by those affected. But here, interestingly, the evidence from the studies is mostly a negative one, is where, for example, where studies see where, because there was no buy-in from those affected, the intervention didn't work. we don't really have the other view, so the positive view, where this was done, it worked fine. There's a much larger number of studies in the sample pertaining to improving access to fisheries markets, with a number of different approaches, be it infrastructure, but there's the issue of maintenance, with introduction of new technology, who pays for that, regulatory framework, again, the issue of acceptance, and in a couple of cases, certification of fisheries products for access for sale internationally. Again, with regards to export orientation, a bit of a, in my view, too neutral view on the benefits of it. The issue of subsidies, it's largely absent from our sample. It's not really an issue where, or a theme that development cooperation or fisheries aid has put much emphasis on. We've seen that, or there's a couple of studies arguing that I mean, this is very much at the core of the debate or the dilemma with regards to the suppression of fisheries subsidies. Is it at least the short-term benefits it might have for parts of the population? Interestingly, there's a study from the OECD from last year that sort of points out at possible avenues for donors to support sort of what could be good subsidies worth supporting, and that would be support to capital markets for people in fisheries to access capital for operations, supporting business and operational skills, disaster payments, and employment insurance. So trying to keep away from inputs to production. Most of the studies, about half of the studies in our sample, have to do with capacity development. So there's a broad recognition that you need to continue developing capacity of institutions in order to improve fisheries management. And as Raphaëlle's shown, we've seen in our sample a clear transition from more production-oriented support, for example, with infrastructure and technology support, and more to management-oriented. And there is, and much of the capacity support today goes into developing fisheries management, monitoring, control, and surveillance, both for industrial and small-scale fisheries. On the other hand, support to data collection and analysis as a basis for any good fisheries management focuses very much in our sample on industrial fishing. I would guess because it's easier than putting in place management and monitoring, control, and surveillance for small-scale fisheries. Interestingly, the issue of the challenges associated with that is largely absent from the sample. And then, whereas there's a lot of emphasis in building capacity, what does that capacity lead to in terms of actually fishing practices, or the status of the resources, or the yields? We don't know that, because most studies don't look for that evidence and do not estimate that. With regards to compliance, enforcement, you can't have fisheries management without better enforcement, and we've seen there where there is a combination of stricter enforcement with measures to promote compliance, be it, for example, through awareness raising or promoting buy-in from those affected, those work better than just enforcing capacity. There is quite some literature, including in our sample, on putting in place alternative income-generating activities. A big question mark is because of the lack of follow-up. What happens to those in the long run after the donor funds disappear? So is it an unfulfilled promise? We can't really say from our sample, but we suspect it is. And then addressing difficult issues, as those of you working in aid and with aid know that, or at least with regards to fisheries aid, most of it targets sort of the technical management level, issues of judicial, political matter, so that the difficult issues of corruption, nepotism, what have you. are usually left unaddressed, at least at the level of the interventions included in our studies. Issues that donors would need to consider. Fisheries, you can't resolve these issues by means of addressing fisheries alone. Donors need to have the legitimacy and the operating space to address these issues, and those are more difficult to do so. And then resources and duration of interventions need to be sort of stepped up for that to happen. I guess I will stop here. I will leave our recommendations with regards to evaluation practice for those who maybe for the discussion afterwards. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raphaëlle and Goncalo. Next, turn to the screen. We should have Raj Desai, who is professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and also a senior fellow at Brookings Institute with us, and he should tell us a bit about, I think there's a video first, but then he will come on live on overfishing and maritime policy as spatial assessment. So let's watch the video to start off with.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, hopefully both live via video link and through this tape presentation. I want to thank the expert group for aid studies for the invitation to share some preliminary findings from some ongoing work on maritime piracy in this presentation, which I will now share with you. Hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation. This is research that is joint with my Georgetown colleague, George Shambaugh. We're asking in our research a basic question, which is why is it that some waters are pirate infested while others are relatively free of pirate incidents? In other words, what explains the geographic distribution of piracy? And relatedly, what are the effects of the following sets of specific spatial factors on piracy, such as general geographic factors, including proximity to shipping traffic, distance from ports, or coastlines, and other such factors? What is the effect of characteristics of nearby countries, such as their levels of fragility and conflict, or their level of development or poverty? What is the effect of any environmental shocks being experienced by proximate coastal areas, such as droughts or floods? And finally, what is the effect of the factor that is of interest to the group, I assume, which is resource depletion through commercial overfishing? Now, a common argument that has been made is that piracy is a byproduct of state weakness because fragile or failed states are not able to patrol their territorial waters effectively, as well as because if failed states have weak enforcement, then the country can become a safe haven for criminals, terrorists, other groups engaged in illegal activities, or because in weak states, local authorities are more easily co-opted. Now, if this is the case, then piracy could be deterred through an emphasis on state building, as well as on increasing the presence of local and international maritime forces. An alternative explanation, keeping in mind that these explanations are not mutually exclusive, is that piracy is simply part of a portfolio of economic livelihood for those facing certain constraints. This would suggest that piracy becomes more attractive when other income sources are restricted. It would also suggest that unemployment rather than absolute poverty levels would explain piracy, just as unemployment might explain other forms of criminality. When it comes to coastal areas that might be adversely affected by economic or environmental shocks, there's an argument that has been made that groups involved have abilities that can more easily transfer to piracy, including seafaring skills, ships, access to boats and whatnot. And if that's the case, then solutions would lie in greater efforts to promote job creation and employment in these areas and to improve the resilience of these areas to these types of shocks. Now let's take a look at our data sources. We take our data from two different sources, the U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the International Maritime Organization, both of which put out bulletins on pirate incidents and keep a database of these reports. And you can see they're both quite similar. They both report a date. They both have a very short narrative of what actually happened. The International Maritime Organization actually lists the ship name and sometimes the flag that the ship is sailing under. But critically for us, they both include very specific geographic locations, which allows us to pinpoint exactly where the incident took place. So we use both of these sources in order to cross-check to make sure that the incidents are actually verified by both. And the data that we have, we divide into 2 5-year periods, 2005 to 2009 and 2010 to 2014. And what you can see in this area is that the big concentration of pirate incidents is taking place off of the Horn of Africa and in Southeast Asia. In fact, both areas are responsible for about 2/3 of all pirate incidents in this location. We also divide up the oceanic space into a number of 1 degree by 1 degree cells, each cell approximately 111 kilometers squared at the equator, and we restrict our ocean to 43.5 north and 35.5 south latitude, which is where 99.9% of incidents have taken place since 2005. I think there's been one incident along the northern coast of Russia or something like that. Just to point out that if you'll notice in this map that most of the ocean space is empty. And that is because maritime piracy is actually quite a rare event. If you look at the distribution of attacks by number of incidents per cell, or that is the number of cells attacked according to the distribution of incidents, you will see that most cells have not had any pirate attacks. In fact, 98% of the spaces we showed in the previous maps have no piracy. They've experienced no incident in either period. There is a small group of cells that have experienced a very high number of attacks. In fact, more than 15 attacks each in each period since 2005. But generally speaking, piracy is still a rare incident when you look at the entire ocean. Now, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime now puts out an index of illegal, unreported, and unregulating, or IUU fishing. According to the Global Initiative, there are 3 ocean basins that have the most IUU fishing going on. In the Western Pacific, which is essentially the South China Sea and Southeast Asian waters, and both sides of the Indian Ocean. These are the locations for 2/3 of the piracy incidents in our data. Now, unfortunately, we do not have detailed geocoded data on IUU fishing. We only have these very general broad indices, which the Global Initiative points out. So we have to use proxies. In particular, we examine the impact of 2 types of commercial fishing practices that have very high rates of bycatch, and which are usually considered an indication of commercial overfishing: pelagic and demersal. Now, one is fishing practices from the water surface down to just above the ocean floor in waters greater than 60 meters in depth. Demersal is fishing that takes place right along the ocean floor or just above. Pelagic fishing is not considered habit modifying, but demersal can be destructive to habitat depending on the type of gear being used. Speaking of which, so in depths of more than 60 meters, you will find a number of different approaches. You will often find bottom trawls that scrape the bottom of the ocean and scrape up the crustaceans and the flatfish that spend time on the bottom. You will find traps that do the same thing. Elsewhere, you will find drift lines and set lines that are connected to boats, and ones that are just that are set by buoys on the surface, the ocean surface. You will also find signs and various gill nets. These are encircling nets that trap the fish that range from the water surface all the way to the ocean floor. Pelagic and demersal practices use different types of gear. Some can use both. The drift lines can, depending on how far they go, can be either pelagic or demersal. Signs can be pelagic or demersal, depending on how deep they are. Same thing with the gill nets. Now, the data that we use comes from the Sea Around Us project, which records very detailed and granular geocoded information on pelagic fishing with high bycatch impact. And the way they measure impact is they take the catch rate, which is the catch per tons of metric tons of catch per kilometer squared divided by year, and standardize it by dividing it by the amount of carbon productivity, on the assumption that higher catch rates in lower productivity oceanic regions would have a higher impact than similar catch rates in higher productivity regions. Now, you'll notice that the upper limit of pelagic impact fishing is about 0.11 compared to demersal fishing, where the upper rate is 43. So it's a factor of 380, 380 times larger than pelagic impact. And this is mainly because of the absolutely huge amount of bottom demersal fishing that goes on in the Yellow Sea along the China coast and in the South China Seas. I guess they really like their shrimp in those areas. Now, we do include a lot of controls. I won't go into details on these controls right now. I'm happy to explore any of them in the question and answer, but just suffice to say that we do include a number of controls in our estimates. All right, so this is our main results, looking at the full sample of oceanic cells, showing that the obviously population plays a major role. Ports plays also, proximity to ports plays a very major role. State fragility plays a major role. Demersal and pelagic overfishing also play major roles, although there is an indirect effect, which suggests that there is a spillover. That's just a simple way of saying that there is a very localized concentration of these effects. So whichever cell, oceanic cell it's occurring in, tends to attract piracy. If you restrict the sample to the economics of the exclusive economic zones in the territorial waters of countries rather than international waters, then the effects of overfishing are far greater. In fact, they're quite a bit larger than in the full sample. That makes sense. Most piracy takes place actually in exclusive economic zones, not on the high seas. But pelagic overfishing and demersal overfishing is quite impactful. The marginal effects of overfishing tend to be concentrated in the upper quintiles of the distribution of the sample. In other words, it is the oceanic cells that have the greatest amounts of pelagic and demersal bycatch fishing that tend to have the greatest impact marginally on pirate attacks. What this means is that if we were to translate this into numbers, the number of pirate attacks in any given 1 degree by 1 degree maritime cell would increase by 1 over a 5-year period if you were to increase the annual volume of high bycatch fishing by these amounts. Now, this is assuming a standard level of ocean productivity, which is a very big assumption because ocean productivity varies quite greatly. But assuming that the standard is 1/10 of a ton of carbon per square kilometer, it would require an increase in 29 metric tons of pelagic fish in the full sample to increase pirate attacks by 1. The demersal effect, on the other hand, is much weaker. So it would require an increase of 11,000 metric tons, which is almost an impossibility, in each 1 degree by 1 degree maritime cell, suggesting that the effect is significant but quite weak. Once you reduce the sample to exclusive economic zones, then the pelagic rate drops to only 21 metric tons required to have a pirate attack, 10,000 metric tons required for a demersal fish. Keep in mind that over the 10-year period, annual global capture production rates were about 37 million metric tons of pelagic fish with a 10% discard rate, 20 million metric tons of demersal fishing with a discard rate that ranges up to 50% depending on method and location. Let me conclude with the following statement about overfishing, which that it might be lead to a kind of cyclical piracy. So take overfishing in Somalia's territorial waters, one of the drivers of piracy, one of the well-known drivers of piracy. But piracy off of the Horn of Africa actually drove away fishing fleets after 2005. They stopped coming there, with the result that Somali piracy dropped to 0 in 2016. However, that meant that the fish stocks were given time to replenish themselves. And as a result, commercial fishing fleets have started to return to Somali waters, which means that Somali piracy has reappeared. So in the recent years, since 2016, there has been a slight uptick in the number of pirate attacks off of the coast of Somalia. So let me stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rai. And now we will move technology. This was a video. Now Rai is online, not on camera, but he could hear what we are speaking about. Yeah, you're on camera as well. Fantastic. So now we will have some time for questions to Rai, if there are some questions or comments on his most interesting findings. And if you would like to phrase a question, I think we should, can we use a mic? Because, yeah, there is a mic. Because then Rai could also hear us. To start off with, I think what you just recently mentioned in the finalization of your presentation about the cyclical, have that been studied also over more long term? This was the last 10-15 years. Could you see the same kind of tendency in other parts of the world, or is it specific for the Horn of Africa?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question. You're asking whether the processes of piracy are unique to the Horn of Africa, or whether they are more general? Was that the question?
Yes, let's face it that.
Yeah. So sorry, it's yeah. So well, we look very generally. And so the processes that we are talking about in terms of the effect of overfishing are actually quite general. However, when you focus in on just the Horn of Africa or just Southeast Asia, there are some differences. And in particular, the effects off of the coast of Somalia are much more a function of the conflict-affected nature of the country, the state fragility, and so on. Whereas in Southeast Asia, there's less of the fragility effect. But overfishing is definitely the effect is definitely present in both of those areas, regionally as well as more generally.
Could we even claim that fisheries is, in this sense, the driving force for privacy? Or is there correlation also with tradable goods, with cargoes? That was my, at least, amateuric impression, that piracy was about other goods being shipped around the Horn of Africa.
Yes, so the proximity to the shipping lanes is a major contributing factor, absolutely. So there's a combination. So you have the driver is that overfishing reduces the livelihoods of groups of individuals that live along the coast and that rely on mostly artisanal but fishing that is affected by these commercial practices, but commercial fishing as well. So that's how it started. But in the early 2000s, that's really how it started. But there are some pirate, as in any activity, illegal activity, eventually it becomes organized. And so with organization, more sophistication, more money being raised, there are some pirate gangs that are capable of going after major tankers or merchant ships for goods. You know, the Maersk incident that we all remember, but other incidents involving tourist boats and other merchant ships. To the extent that in the height of Somali piracy, one of the solutions was for naval convoys to accompany ships through the Gulf of Aden. So the proximity to that critical choke point at the Gulf of Aden is important for Somalia, and of course in Indonesia it's access to the Straits of Malacca and other critical shipping points as well. So piracy is not obviously the only driving factor, but it's essentially what starts the movement towards piracy when the livelihood of these coastal areas is affected, and is definitely still a contributing factor.
Okay, thanks. Any further questions or comments from the us gathered here in Stockholm today?
Is it specifically for RAI or the general study?
Yes, use the mic so then we can also cross the Atlantic Ocean with our question.
Sorry, but my question to you is this, should we now ask specifically about RAI's presentation?
Yes.
Okay, then I have no question.
Okay, no further questions. It's like a trial. No further questions. Any further questions? Yeah, Goncalo, you raise your hands. At least you have the mic.
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank
Yes,
you.
please.
Very interesting study.
Okay.
A question is, you mentioned overfishing. Did you disaggregate overfishing by national fleets and foreign fleets? Because in the case of Somalia, at least there was a supposition that that would be the case, overfishing by foreign fleets. Have you data on that?
So we don't have the problem is that we are not able to. So the thing about these illegal fishing fleets is that they turn off their transponders. So they we're not able to track them. Most of one of the I guess dirty secrets of maritime shipping and transit is that keeping the transponder on is somewhat voluntary, or reporting your location is somewhat voluntary. So the data on shipping that we have is essentially from imputed ship journeys. We know where they leave, the port they leave from, and the port they arrive to, but sometimes they turn it off when they're going through pirated waters, because some sophisticated pirates can track boats that way. With commercial fishing fleets, they are the worst offenders. But we do have information from the Global Initiative that the worst offenders in the Western Indian Ocean are Chinese, Taiwanese. There are a couple of other countries that are on that list. Russia, Libya apparently was a big contributor there as well. So we do know that there are these fleets from these countries that are very prominent in those waters, but we don't have the geocoded information of those ships' movements. Which would be a great thing, because then we could actually see what the impact of overfishing is based on the presence of those ships in those waters. But we only have anecdotal information on that.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, Rai, to be with us today here in Stockholm, and have a good day over there. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Now, let's continue our discussion here in Stockholm, and I would like now to introduce and welcome up on the floor, if not the stage, David Lymer. And David is a environment assessment specialist at the Swedish University for Agriculture Sciences, and formerly you worked also for the Swedish aid agency SIDA. And David was with me and some others also part of the reference group, also having been looking into different drafts of this report. So what is your take on this study and the outcome that Raphaëlle and Goncalo has presented today? Please, David. I think it should be unmuted.
Okay, here we go. So my views of the report is that it was great work. Congratulations, fantastic. I was surprised that a lot of the things I thought came out in the report. So that was nice. That sort of, as you said, I've been working both with SIDA and FAO on fisheries for nearly 15 years. So at least my views and the views of my colleagues of what works right now is sort of coming out in this report. I had one observation, which I think is important to make before we go on, is that fishing also occurs in lakes and rivers and wetlands. So the focus of the SDG 14 is of course on maritime fishing, but as a sort of an aid sector, fisheries as an aid sector, we shouldn't forget about these fishing activities as well, as potentially the poverty focus is even larger in lakes and rivers when it comes to fishing. Should I continue?
Yes,
I
please.
can keep talking.
You have the floor. In your comments, if I could just put the question, I will come back to that later also. I think the study also presented us the shift from production to focus on production to management to stop overfishing that came about late 90s. From your perspective and your experience, has that been enough, too little or too much? But we can come to that question as well, but please give your thoughts on the study. But I think that was one of the outcomes of the report, if not recommendation.
Okay, I think I'll start with that before I forget it.
Yes.
I think we're moving there. As you said, we had a lot of, in all agricultural sector, aid was sort of focused on increasing production and also so in fisheries. I mean, there's now the focus is more on sustainability, the use of the resource. And I think that also came out in the report that you couldn't find too much support or evidence that small-scale fisheries benefited from these interventions. And I think that the underlying problem is that we don't actually know how many are small-scale fisheries. We don't know how many artisanal fisheries there are. We don't know how many subsistence fisheries there are. So any intervention we make and any effort to sort of sustainably manage the resource will fail because we don't have the full information on how that resource is used. So I think that is something we have to work more on to know who is actually using the resource. And then there will be this trade-off that the authors talk about, that there will be winners and losers. And hopefully we can see more of the small-scale fishers and artisanal fisheries and subsistence fishers being the winners, as the industrial fishers have had their sort of chance of exploiting the resource and they have failed, I could say.
Okay, now turn to the study.
Yeah, so one more thing that were mentioned was the need for capacity development, and I think that still holds true, that we need more capacity development, especially in regional fisheries bodies and is that me? Regional fisheries management organizations. We need to manage these resources regionally, shared stocks, for example. And it's also probably more cost-effective way to come up with the best scientific advice that you would need to actually make a conclusion on the resource if it's sustainably used and what are sustainable yields. More. Well, yeah, and the IUU problem, you didn't talk too much about that in the presentation, but I think there is a clear link also here to human rights issues. We know a lot of these ships, they run under the radar, and we hear reports of slavery and not very good conditions for people working on board. So there's a strong connection there as well, which could be a focus of aid interventions in the future, I think.
Thanks. And now I should turn away from this table. Next, I would like to welcome and introduce Kristofer Rietz. Your work at the EU Commission, policy coordinator on these fisheries issues. And please, your views and takes on the...
Yeah, we can share.
You can share the mic.
I have a very loud voice.
Yes, even crossing the Atlantic Ocean.
No, don't. This is embarrassing. So thank you very much. So my name is Kristofer Dyrje. I'm Swedish, and I used to be a fisheries regulator. I worked in DG Mara for a few years, particularly on fisheries and development and international fisheries. And I chaired both the two regional fisheries management organizations, the Commission for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna and the Southern Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement. So, and I told the organizers that I no longer work in fish, but the organizers very happily invited me anyway. And I'm very grateful to be here. It's excellent. It's good stuff. Really good to be here. And the issues are very, very dear to my heart. First of all, I want to say, as you said, it's a brilliant study. It's really, really good. And I think it should be compulsory reading for most aid agencies and IFIs who are involved in fisheries management, sustainable fisheries management support. I really do. And I also agree that it confirmed my own views. That's not necessarily a good thing. You might have, it's good because I liked it. It's my views. It's not the case. I really do think this is it. And I'm happy to say that the conclusions are reflected in most of the EU aid to sustainable fishing. We have the EU side is the largest donor in the world on fisheries, on support for sustainable fisheries. And we're focusing on, we're totally avoiding supporting the catching industry. There's no money for nets, engines, boats. And there's a total focus on science, on value chain development, on monitoring, control, and surveillance. And there's usually a link to the EU IUU policy, which is a very powerful tool to combat bad practices in the world. There's only one weakness, I think, for me, from my perspective in the report, and that's the chapter on the part on subsidies. Whereas I agree totally on the conclusion that it doesn't get enough attention, that's the very important driver for overfishing, and that the process in WTO is an outrage. I think the chapter is I simply disagree. In the report, you say that you don't make a distinction. You just say subsidies, and you say that that's what the literature says. I disagree with that as well, because I think the literature is quite fisheries management literature. Academia is quite it's not controversial to say that you can distinguish between good subsidies and bad subsidies. And the good subsidies are in fact necessary to create the regulatory framework that it's a good fishery management system requires. And there's a good example of that in various studies. Interrupt me if I'm droning on too long. So in a lot of studies, particularly by Canadian Professor Sumaila, you will see that the EU often features very, very high as a subsidizing country. And there's a very simple reason for that, because what he does, and he does it frequently, and we told him many, many times, and he says he will not do that anymore, but he has, up till now, he has. So he's taking the whole EU, the fund, EMFF, European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, and an aggregate number, and says this is EU subsidies, this is an outrage. Most of that money goes to aquaculture, research, it goes to social support system for fishermen who fishers not having work, etc. Quite a little bit goes to the catching industry, and a large chunk of that is for monitoring, control, and surveillance. So it's not fair. These numbers are not fair. And from the EU perspective, and I remind people here that Sweden is a member of the EU, from the Swedish EU perspective, subsidies for a sustainably managed fishery these are good subsidies. We're not fighting them at all. Interesting comments on small scale. Small scale fisheries is a super problem in fisheries. It's either is hailed as something fantastic, and some people, particularly in developing countries, will say that small scale fisheries per definition is sustainable. That is total bullshit. Small scale fisheries can be extremely harmful. It's also true that it's very, very difficult to measure. And I, as an example, I worked for for 2 years. I was part of the EU team negotiating fisheries subsidies in WTO, and I can talk endlessly about that if you want to. And the stuff we heard in the WTO, in plenary, completely open, straight out, is horrific, is mind-boggling. Big countries saying we have zero control of our waters. We have no idea what's going on. And we just have to subsidize our artisanal fishing fleets. We just have to. And we have no idea how much they catch. We have no idea. India is such a country, completely open in plenary, said we have no control of our waters. Then someone else said, well, that's funny because you actually export fish to the EU, our fisheries products, and if you don't have control, that's IUU, so we can block it. And then they said, oh God, no, the fish we export to you is of course completely compliant, no problem there. So yeah, I think I haven't missed anything.
I have a follow-up question to you.
Yes.
Before I also invite back on stage Raphaëlle and Goncalo. When we started this study, not dealing with the fisheries aid on a daily basis, I thought, if I look at fisheries, what do I think about first when it comes to EU? It's not aid policy, but the fishery policy. Yeah. And that is my question now. Do you see any coordination, or are they contra-cyclical, or they bind together, or what it's doing in aid, is that being downgraded by fishery policy? No. Or what is the match?
Well, it's a good question. I'm happy you asked it. I can give you an hour presentation on this.
I like that.
The common fisheries policy was reformed a few years ago. It went from focus on catching, as you said, to focus on sustainability. It's a sustainability policy today, with focus on MSY, science-based decisions, and stock preservation. It's not perfect, but it's ecosystem-based management system as well. It's certainly not perfect. Some waters are doing better than others. The Mediterranean is not great. North Sea substantially better, but it's always we're doing our best, I think. A part of that policy is that the same policy should be the basis for the EU's external policy, and there are a number of areas there where we work, sort of projecting the CFP objectives internationally. One is being very active in regional fisheries management organizations. That is does everybody know what an RFMO is? Regional Fisheries Management Organization is? if you all nod, I won't say anything more. You
Increase
all know what it
our
is.
level of knowledge.
No, well, it's basically the high seas are non-regulated, but the UN Convention for Law of the Sea allows fishing nations and coastal states to get together, create an organization that manage the fish in these areas, and that's what it is. And the EU tries to be a member of most of them, especially where the EU is fishing. And in each RFMO, the EU is supposed to be a constructive force. Then we have bilateral fisheries agreements. In the report, it actually says these are subsidies. I fundamentally disagree. I can take that over the coffee and explain why, but they're not subsidies under the way we see it, and certainly not under the WTO, the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. However, these are also reformed, and they're supposed to be only take surplus fish. They're totally transparent, contrary to what we heard before, the Chinese fleets, the Russian fleets, or whatever. Their agreements. They also have agreements. You don't know anything about these. You just know they're there, taking the fish, not giving a shit about what happens to the poor people on board, on the ground. We also not competing with the artisanal fleets. Mm-hmm. So we're taking sort of, at least that's the idea. And a large chunk of the money is supposed to go to support to fisheries management in the partner countries. And then we have development aid, and as I said, the EU, that's a DevCo, Europe Aid, is the biggest donor, together with member states, that Sweden and others, France, also quite active, Germany. We are the biggest donors in the world when it comes to fisheries management, and the same, as I said in the beginning of my little presentation here, which is just a commentary, of course, no support to the catching industry, a lot of support to science, a lot of support to management, and a clear link, often a link with the fight against illegal fishing.
One final question on EU. We can continue afterwards, but I'm interested now to understand the magnitude. If you compare, if it's possible, over a certain year or time period, the development aid from EU to fisheries compared to the common fisheries policies, is it 1 to 5, or are they even, or is that?
No, I can't. I don't have the numbers, but they're of course not comparable at all.
No.
I don't have the numbers.
No. Okay. By that, I invite back on stage Raphaëlle and Goncalo, and you will have possibility to comment on what you've heard from David and Kristofer, and then we have a discussion.
Could I just have a brief comment?
Definitely.
Just
Please.
a comment back on
that's
the talk
good.
here.
I like that.
So I think you sort of alluded to that most of the countries that you do agreements with don't know the capacity and the resources harvested from the artisanal fleet. And still you say that the resources that you buy won't affect the resource that the artisanal fleet use. How does that match up?
Is on? Hello.
Yes.
No, it depends on what you're catching. For instance, outside sort of Mauritania, for instance, you go for sardines and certain fish stocks that moves between pelagic stocks, and these are not the fish that artisanal fisher folks are taking. They are taking other things like cephalopods, for instance, in Mauritania. For various reasons. One reason could be they don't have the capacity, they don't have the boats, they don't have the means to do it. Most of them probably do want to get the means, but then they will get the means from somebody else, not from us, because we're not supporting production of fishing boats for vessels.
Okay, now, Raphaëlle and Goncalo, if you have some comments of what you heard from Kristofer and David, and stay calm, we will open up soon for all of you, but start off with Goncalo and Raphaëlle, please.
Yeah. Do you want to start? Okay, I think we've gotten quite used to responding to comments throughout this process,
yes.
So we'll do that. I'll start with sort of chronologically. David mentioned that obviously inland fisheries is very important. We had it in our sample. The truth is there are very little studies, or very few studies, so it really doesn't come through. There's a couple of studies on floodplain fisheries in Bangladesh, interestingly, nothing on Lake Victoria, for example. So it was part of the. Oh, sorry. Okay, it was included, but it didn't come out because there are no such studies, or not many. Then Torgny had a very interesting question, this progression from production to management. Did it come too late, and is it enough? I think that's a very interesting question to which I don't really have an answer. I have a few reflections. One of them being that the aid commitments so the ODA commitments, or official development assistance, is to the fisheries sector, or to ocean-related sectors, so not only fisheries, is today much less in absolute terms than what it was in the 80s and 90s. So, and at that time, much of it was going into production, getting more fish out of the sea, whereas we could say that today most of it is going, or most of the aid is going into management promotion or improving management. So we're still not, or the development community is not there where it was before. So although, and that's an issue we discussed quite a bit back and forth with the EBA, and so there appears to be an upswing in ODA to ocean-related sectors in the 2 last years, and let's see how that turns out, and where that aid is going to, and if that upswing continues. Some authors say that donors need to commit much more to management if they are to reverse the bad that former production-oriented aid provoked earlier. But that's a point of discussion. And then another issue that, and partly answers something that you asked now towards the end, Tony, how aid relates to national commitments to fisheries policy. And there are estimates that it's around 7 to 8 times less than in the 25 largest fishing nations. They give, or they invest, or the commitments in national policy, fisheries policy, is about 7 to 8 times higher than aid commitments in total. So that gives us a perspective also of what aid can or cannot achieve in terms of fisheries management. So the national commitments are probably much more important. I agree with David that IUU fishing is an issue of human rights. And that is, and we try to briefly mention that in the report. It's not sufficient, or it's not at all touched upon in our sample. So the issue of slavery, of human trafficking associated with that is not mentioned. I mean, including, for example, the issue of promoting employment on board. Yes, it's good to have employment if you have none, but what are the employment conditions? And that's interestingly an issue that has come up with the European fisheries agreements in the past and currently, I think. Then turning on to Kristofer, I do agree that our treatment of subsidies is not the strongest point in the report. Part of it I would attribute to the fact that there is very, very little in the literature that we reviewed. So we try to stick as much to what this literature gave us. So not try to enlarge the analysis too much about that. Whether the access payments by the European Union are good or bad subsidies, that's an issue we can take over coffee. I could have my views on that, but there are authors there, including Sumaila, that do not consider those to be good subsidies. But I do take your point, and I do agree that there's much more to say on the issue of subsidies than what we have in the report. I do take your point and agree, and I hope it's sufficiently captured in the report that small-scale fisheries is very diverse and a very complicated problem. And I would invite Tumi to say a few words on that, because I know you've been thinking and have reflected much on the issue and have seen much of it. I think that's all I had to respond to for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Raphaëlle, any further comments, please?
Yeah, maybe
Yes, something like this.
Maybe just to add, in relation to the subsidies more specifically, so the purpose of that study was very much to look at interventions that work and don't work. So in the sort of like data that we managed to harvest from whatever is out there, we actually looked at evaluation reports. So this means that there might be a lot of studies related to subsidies that discuss more theoretically or discussions about like are subsidies good or bad. But if they're not related to an intervention, it's kind of unlikely that we actually picked it up through our study. Yeah.
Yes, now we have a discussion. Please, Kristofer.
I was probably too harsh. I actually agree. It would be wrong to do what you didn't do. It would have been wrong in this report. So I think it's a really good report, and I think the purpose of it is to look at development aid and see how efficient and inefficient it has been in this particular sector. The subsidies is not really in the scope. You know, I totally agree, and it would have been wrong. It would have been a completely different study if you dwelled into that, because that's people, it's a big area and very controversial. I just disagreed a little bit what you said there about that. You said, you scoped it all together, but that's, it's not really relevant for the conclusions, the important conclusions on this report, which is on a different matter altogether. And there, thumbs up.
I just got an idea for a new EBA study. Are there good and bad subsidies? Now, David.
Yeah, just maybe my final remark. So I mean, the study itself, it's based on what has been tried, basically. So it doesn't talk about what type of innovative new approaches you could use to improve aid to fisheries. So I think that's something you need to carry with you. So this is not the Bible. It's a few good pointers on what could be done. So I think one area that hasn't been tried that much before is the combination of fisheries and environment. So you can't really get any good fisheries or resource outcomes if you at the same time don't improve the environment. So I know at SIDA we had at least a few new initiatives where we combined sort of regional fisheries management organizations with the relevant sea convention, which is then responsible for the environmental outcomes, and then they together could set objectives that are relevant both for environment and fisheries. So I think that could be my take on what we should do more of.
Okay, thanks. I will now open up also for comments and reflections and questions from all of us. I just one thought that maybe I can come back to is that looking into, or what I heard from Desai, I think if I got him right, that one of his findings was that piracy was driven more by lack of employment than poverty. Maybe they are correlated, but I think for the future, I guess it's both the poverty, I guess, close correlation to employment, and is that where we are heading now, rather than seek other forms of employment if there are fishermen or women that cannot make a living of fishing nowadays with drawdown on the aid, etc. So now, I think Jan, you were first. Please, and introduce yourself, because this is online.
First, I would like to thank you very much for interesting presentations, and I'm looking very much forward to read your study. My name is Jan Gerninger. I was the head of this SIDA's National Resource and Environmental Department from 2005 to 2008, so I share some responsibility for bad or good in what Sweden has been doing in this field. And Swedish development cooperation in fisheries started, I think, already in the 60s. Somalia was one of the first countries. Now my question relates to the scope of your study, which in its turn relates to the scope of the SDG goals, goal 14, and the scope of the studies that you have been studying. Actually, you, David, brought that up when you talked about inland fisheries. But when I was working with this, we widened the scope with the question of how do you define fishing. We have the question of seafood in general, shellfish, we had the question of aquaculture, and the situation for fisheries very much depend on aquaculture, how that develops, and there are very strong environmental connections between fishing for real fishes and fishing and cultivation of other products. The most horrible example perhaps is, in my view, shrimp farming, which destroys the breeding environment for many important commercial fishes. On the other hand, the demand for fish products is increasing very much, and aquaculture obviously is very important to solve that problem in an environmentally friendly way, provided that aquaculture could be carried through in a sustainable way. When it comes to shrimp farming now, what is stated to be certified products are introduced on the Swedish market with the help of, for example, World Wildlife Fund. In my view, those products are not sustainable. World Wildlife Fund is fooling, as I see it, the consumers, stating that something is sustainable which is not sustainable, and other environmental organizations disagree. So my question is, to what extent do your study and the studies that you have studied broaden the scope towards these areas that I mentioned?
Thank you. I think we take on that question immediately, and then there are other questions that will come.
Yeah. Well, we very consciously did not include aquaculture, and that was a decision taken very early in the study design, because it's a. My guess is it was probably an issue of time and resources available. I mean, the literature on aquaculture is very, very vast. And it's at the same time it's a different kind of activity. I mean, you could say, okay, it produces fish, as does capture fisheries, but it's not the same activity. It's not the same value chains. It's not the same environmental problems. So we thought, okay, we are limited in the scope that we can take on this study. So let's focus on what we can, or let's focus on capture fisheries. So to take on the issue of aquaculture, we would probably need to do a complete new study. We could probably use or follow the exact same approach. My guess is there would be more data, at least on the output of or sort of the input-output equation of aquaculture than there is for capture fisheries, but that's just a guess. So that was a very conscious decision. On the certification by WWF of sustainability or their sustainability claims, I don't really know, so I can't answer that. And then one thing that you mentioned in the beginning, sort of the scope of this study related to the scope of the SDG 14s and the fact that some of the studies in our sample and some of the aid goes back 50 years, and the SDG 14s are just 4 years old now. And that's something that actually to me raised our attention to in the beginning, that you can't expect an intervention from the 90s to respond to SDG 14's targets because they weren't there. And that's very true. At the same time, the issues are not that dissimilar. I mean, there were issues of income, of making a livelihood from fishing. There are issues of sustainability of fishing and how do you address that have been there since there is fishing, or at least fisheries management. So although the wording of the SDG 14s is very specific and very new, the issues that it addresses are pretty old, I would say, and they apply largely to earlier interventions.
Christoph?
Fish and other sea products, are they included in SDG 14 as you see?
Yeah, they're not. It's not specific to fish. It's specific to stuff you take out of the sea and eat.
Okay. Kristofer, David, and a comment on this. Now, Eva, and I know that you have some own experience from research in small-scale fisheries and livelihoods in East Africa.
Does it work? Yes.
And
My name is Eva Tobisson. I have a background in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, but also in research on, from a community perspective, on coastal communities in East Africa since 20 years or 25 years back. But I look forward to reading the report, and I think it's perhaps unfair to have comments before you have. I'm trying to glimpse it through, but it's a reflection rather than question, but in line with what Jan and also David has indicated, that I think there is a need, if you don't decide from the beginning that we don't deal with artisanal fisheries, you have to account for the fact that livelihoods are diversified. People don't live from fish and alone. It's a lot of other marine resources, terrestrial resources, which are combined. And if you follow a community or communities over time, you see that there is a variation not only between years and seasons, but also in people are enormously quick to swift to other activities if fishing fails, for instance. And you have to understand that in order to, from a community point of view, see what really happens, and in order to have good aid projects. And so this is just a reflection, but I'm so happy that at least marine resources and marine management is raised in a report like this one, because it's not really something that is very topical, although it's so important for, not the least for poverty reduction and for the livelihoods of people who live in poverty today. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And the reflections on what? Yeah, Goncalo?
It's just, I might not have been sufficiently clear. I mean, we do have small-scale fisheries and community-based interventions. I mean, there are plenty of them in the sample. What we do not have is aquaculture. So, but I do take your point. I mean, and it's the aid and many of the intervention are much broader than just the fisheries or the capture component. Yeah, you'll see that when you read the report. But there's plenty of that. So that's very clear in the sample, and other studies show that's increasingly difficult in databases of aid to identify fisheries or interventions that are specific to fisheries, because increasingly fisheries is just part of larger programs or larger interventions that have much more to do with community development or societal development more broadly, and then fisheries is just a part of it.
Yeah. Just one comment to that. I think you covered it very well. The issues you raised in the report, you looked at a large number of evaluations of projects, and you noted that it's very clear in the report that without local buy-in, there's no success. Now, local buy-in into the project is key. Without that, crap results. And it's well reflected. And you also mentioned, I think, in the key conclusions, the fact that one should probably look at alternative, trying to assist in finding alternative things to do for the coastal community, fishers and often women who are engaged in fish processing in Africa, for instance. But this is not easy. This is very, very difficult. It's not like here, because you've got to remember this, developing industry, it's all countries, we're all people. So the fishing industry here in Sweden gone from a quite big industry to just employing a couple of people, It's not a lot of people who are into fishing. Quite well managed waters though. So, and the fishers who went out of business, they could do something else. It could be doctors or engineers or whatever. And the people you worked with probably don't have that alternative. It's not that easy to go from fishing in a small village in East Africa to become a doctor. It's not sort of an obvious step. Whereas if you grew up in somewhere on the Swedish west coast, it's not a big step. And this is a big issue. And I don't think there is a template for solving this problem. You probably know that better than most in this room. It's not nothing that we just dream up and fix. But it's certainly an issue. And just saying finally that the small-scale fishing can be quite damaging to the ecosystem. It can be quite damaging. Industrial fishing can be quite good to the ecosystem. It's all dependent on the fishery management system you have in place. That's a conclusion.
Interesting conclusion. Now, like the Speaker of the House of the Commons, I will turn from the right to the left, and I have Tumi first.
Thank you. It has been a privilege to be part of this work here with Goncalo. I didn't do much, but I've learned a lot from it. And I have a particular interest in the small-scale fishing because I think it's a word we should abandon. Small-scale can mean so many different things to different people at different times, in different places. So it's not a uniform thing. And if you look at FAO statistics, you will see that in 1985, the average fisher caught 3.5 tons per year. Today, the average fisher catches 1.2 tons per year. And of course, he's not out there fishing all the time. And that's exactly right what Eva says. And that's why we need to understand better what we mean by small-scale fishing. And I suggest that we should stop talking about it. We should maybe talk about subsistence fishing and then fishing as a way of life, or making a living from fishing, totally. And it's when you look at the studies that were included in this study here, they're all from the last 2 decades. Even if development cooperation in fisheries was one of the first to start when development cooperation started in the 50s. Fishing was very high on the agenda, and it was production oriented, so it didn't look at small-scale fishing, it looked at industrial fishing. And that's where all the money went for the next 3 to 4 decades after it started. And we only see studies on small-scale fishing in this study from the last 2 decades. And there are not that many of them. Also because they're hidden within a larger studies like Goncalo was talking about. But if you walk down the coast in East Africa, like Eva has done and many of us have done, you see that there are basically 2 types. There are the guys on the small canoes that you can see from the shore, and they have got very primitive methods and very low tech, and this is just a small part of their livelihoods. And then you have the guys that actually invest in fisheries, and they often with aid money, actually, even if nobody will admit it, they are engaged in what I would call mining. They can go further out, they've got better gear, they've got an engine, they've got a smartphone with a GPS on, and they know where they're going, and they make good money. So when you talk about average fishing have gone down from 3.5 tons to 1.2, the disparity within this group is enormous, and there are lots of people that make good money on this so far. But this is happening right as we speak now. You can go to Lake Victoria and you can see the same thing. You have Museveni deploying his army onto the small-scale fishermen, and who do they target? He targets the guys in the small dugout canoes with the small mesh nets that only go a mile or so offshore and only are catching a couple of kilos a day. And they have got their gears burnt and their boats burnt, but those are encouraged are the ones with legal meshes, or even bigger, and engines, and go far out, and they catch an accumulated stock of Nile perch far off. And this is sort of like mining. But if we, as donors or development workers, don't recognize the different components of the so-called small fishing and address it, we are not going to solve any problems. And I think this is something we need to think of in development cooperation. What are we doing? And I think we are mainly avoiding the issue.
Thank you. A comment from David?
Yeah, just to bring in the third category. So when I sat in Mozambique in a meeting with all the fishermen in that particular bay, we were talking about how to do their fishing more sustainably and setting up reserves. Suddenly, 40 women come down on the beach and start fishing with cast nets and baskets, and we never mention those, the women. We say that men are fishing and women are not at all involved in fishing, it's totally wrong. And we need to sort of stop thinking that, and that would open up a whole new avenue for development aid to focus on those women. And what they were fishing for, that was dinner for their families.
Thank you for raising that. Now we have at least 2 more questions. I think we lump them together. We start with our gentleman in the orange sweater.
Thank you. My name's Tim Daw. I'm from the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University. I'm a researcher in coastal development. And it relates to the previous discussion a little bit. I mean, the target 14.7 is very clearly framed in terms of increasing the economic benefits to small island development states and low-income developing countries. And we've been talking about these other contributions. So I wondered in the report, were you able to, how much you were constrained by that, or whether you're able to evaluate the contribution of these fisheries projects on poverty alleviation, well-being more generally, food security specifically. So beyond the value, and maybe this is to do with why we don't work on these kind of smallest of the small-scale fisheries. And then the second question was, you've done a great job of mining the information that's available, and you draw attention to the lack of really good after the event evaluation, particularly after the longer term. So I wonder, is there anything were you able to find sort of anything on rebound effects, unintended consequences in those few studies that were found later? How much evidence is there for that? And you've mined the data that's available, and my question is then, how can we learn about these kind of longer term effects or more complex effects or other aspects that aren't reported in the current monitoring framework? I think it's really great that you also recommend how the monitoring can be done better. How can we find out about what wasn't covered in the material that you looked at? So,
before taking that, I will ask or invite our next speaker or questioner.
Hi, I'm Cristiano Lanzano. I work at the Nordic Africa Institute, and I have very little knowledge on fisheries. I work on mining, on artisanal mining communities in Africa, and I think the parallel are many, especially in terms of relations between large scale and small scale, but also about how difficult it is to lump all artisanal and small scale activities in one single definition, also in mining. I had a few questions, more directly about the study. Did the studies that you review, were the studies that you review talking about aid mostly directed to governments, or did you also have aid flows directed to other actors, private actors, NGOs, or producers' organizations, and peasants' organizations in general, among the beneficiaries of aid? That was one question. Another question was about I forgot. But no, I don't have a about the issue of food security and food sovereignty, because this is very dominant in the debate about aid and cooperation to the agricultural sector, and I was wondering if this is was also present in more recent times in the interventions that you reviewed, in terms of, for example, support to local commercialization of fish, and and also local transformations in improving the value chain locally. And the last one was about I don't know very much about the historical dimension of the historical evolution of fisheries, but in the mining sector as well as in the agricultural sector, it is very clear that this shift towards governance issues and management issues is very clearly reflecting the phase of structural adjustment where basically states were incentivized to relinquish control over those sectors and basically give them or privatize massively. So I wonder if there is a similar history in fisheries, for example, dismissing marketing agencies and so on, that then is reflected in this shift towards governance and management improvement in aid.
There we have a handful of questions or comments, and now I start with Goncalo. You have the mic, at least.
Yes, maybe I'll start from the latest ones. No, regarding this sort of more neoliberal or de-governmentalized approach, no, we didn't see that. It's not very clear in the fisheries aid as reported in the literature in this study. So the simple answer is no, we did not see, and not even close to what is reported in other sectors. Food security. And your question was whether the studies reflect or sort of show effects on food or discuss the issue of food security, and most of them do not. There's a couple, if I recall well. Now I don't have all of them in my head, but if I recall well, there's a couple of them that discuss the issue or risks to food security from support to export markets, and that I briefly mentioned that. But in terms of, for example, there's a number of studies on improving post-harvest processes, but there's not a single study measuring any effects in terms of food security or calorie intake or protein intake, for example, as a result of such interventions. Then your first question of whether the intervention studies or the aid in those interventions was directed exclusively to governments. Now, I must recognize we didn't look into that systematically, but from my recollection, and please any of the other authors correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not only governments that are the beneficiaries or the recipients of aid. There's other, I would say most of them are government or public institutions at different levels, but there are also examples of NGOs or private actors. I can't really remember. I would need to go back to the sample. So, but not so. It's not exclusively on government. Then, Tim, your two difficult questions, and I'll start with probably the easier one. Sort of longer-term poverty or income effects. We can't really say. There's, in my view, one convincing study in the entire sample, and it's not sort of a pure aid intervention that does a robust estimation of income effects of a given phenomenon, which is basically the introduction of mobile technologies in India. It could have been an aid intervention, but it was not. And then so that's the only study that attempts to do a robust sort of with and without treatment comparison. And that, but maybe a weakness is that it doesn't look into long-term effects. If I recall well, the study or the effects are measured like 1 year after the introduction of the technologies, and then it varies because it was introduced differently in different regions. There is no single study going back to an intervention site, say 5 years, and comparing income levels with the benchmark, with a convincing counterfactual. That doesn't exist in the sample, unfortunately. I mean, that's exactly the kind of the question we posed at the very start of this study, was trying to look for those effects and see what can we say from, and now we're talking income, but we're also talking what's happening to fish stocks, what's happening to livelihoods more broadly. That data doesn't exist in these evaluations. we can talk more about that over coffee. But, and then unintended consequences. Well, some authors say there's a positivity bias or a positive results bias in much of what is written, not only development evaluations. We were tempted at some point to write that in the report, but we then took it out because it's speculative. But I would say, looking at what we mostly have positive effects. Mm-hmm. There's very few cases of sort of reporting of unintended consequences. And if I recall well, there's one case of reporting of negative unintended consequences, and that is, if I recall well, it's in India, and it's the sort of the introduction of mobile technologies for disaster prevention that leads to people communicate, or fishermen communicating about better fishing grounds, and it leads to overfishing. So also very, very little on that front either. And I don't intend this to sound as a criticism, as I've done my share of evaluations as well, and I know that an evaluator is bound by what the commissioner wants, what's in the terms of reference. And so if you're asked to look into a specific thing, that's what you're going to look into. So that's probably, or might be whether, or speculating a bit, where the positivity bias might come from. And then you pose this very difficult question that I don't really have an answer for, but maybe Raphaëlle might have. Where can we find data or evidence or that is not captured in our sample? I don't know. Well, maybe Mary Frances has an answer. So good to have co-authors.
Thank you, Goncalo, and thank you for the wonderful work that we've produced together. It makes me very proud to hear so many interesting questions. So Tim, you asked, where do you find what works and what doesn't? And I think just piggybacking on what Goncalo just said, you know, there likely is some bias, not only from the nature of the evaluator herself going into a place and you know, with a commissioner's guide behind trying to figure out answers to these specific questions. Not only in the temporal scale, where most of the evaluations are either taking place as the project is happening or just immediately after, but also just in the nature of ODA itself, which a lot of these studies were, you know, overseas development assistance. Governments are not allowed to say if things go badly. So there's this sort of triple threat going on when you're trying to look for, we tried this thing and it didn't work and we think this is why. The honesty is a bit missing. And I think that if you were to look for where you could figure out what truly is happening, what truly has gone well, gone wrong, why, you would need to speak with people. I think that's the only way to get into the minds of the project managers, the people who are on the ground working these projects, speak with the evaluators about what they truly saw, you know, and I think that's obviously quite intensive, right, to actually, but I think that's where the answers are, mostly.
Thank you, Mary Frances Davidson, part of the team that produced this study.
Simon.
Now, final two questions on my left side. We start with you, and pass the mic, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lina Westlund. I work for FAO, in particular on the small-scale fisheries and the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries. First, well, thank you to the authors. I find this really interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading the report in detail. I wanted to make one comment or share a piece of information, and also then I have a question. The small-scale fisheries, it's been mentioned that we don't know enough about it, and I couldn't agree more. So I just wanted to tell you that FAO, together with World Fish and Duke University, is working on a study that we call the Illuminating Hidden Harvest, where we try to dig into the contribution of small-scale fisheries in terms of catches, employment, effect on the environment, contribution to food security, to nutrition, etc. We're doing this work based on some 50 country case studies, And we're in the middle now of pulling it together, but it will take some time to analyze, so we expect to publish this in about a year's time. So stay tuned. I hope that will help a little bit to better understand small-scale fisheries. This work also looks into the diversity of small-scale fisheries, and while I don't maybe completely agree with Tumi, there's some aspects of what he's saying I do agree with, that it's a very diverse sector and it's not possible just to talk about small and large scale and that's it, because there are many different variations. So we're also trying to look into that, how to analyze and understand the diversity and the different types of small-scale fisheries using a matrix that looks not only at vessel size or engine size, that is usually the way small-scale fisheries are defined, but also looking at how they are connected to local communities, number of crew, where do they fish, etc. So hopefully that will also shed some light on the different types of fisheries. Then to my question, and David already touched upon this, and I was interested in your work to hear something more about gender and the role of women. You mentioned as one of your first conclusions that post-harvest and value addition were possibly intervention that gave good effects, and I was wondering if there was any gender dimension to this, and also the role of women, which is often hidden because women don't fish, but they certainly, well, they don't fish that often. We mainly see men fishing, but they are very much involved in post-harvest, and of course they are also involved in certain types of fisheries. So if you had some more comments on that aspect, I would appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, and you can pass on the mic to Jan Erik.
My name is Jan Engström. I used to be a fishery economist in Rome a long time ago. I have a question related to consumers in developed markets and consumers in developing countries. So what have you come across any studies on, for example, fish meal production or the production of salmon in Chile, in Norway, in Scotland? To what extent is this a problem for poor people in developing countries that need protein? And I remember I was also involved in Lake Victoria. I realized that a lot of the fish is now exported. When I was in Lake Victoria, there was different kinds of species and that were eaten by the local people. Okay, so my question is related to developed and non-developed markets.
Okay, thank you. And some comments or on reflections on these questions, please, and then we will have final round. I will pose one question to all of you. But start, Raphaëlle, please.
Yeah, I'll take the question on gender. So we didn't set to look at gender, and that's something that came up in our discussions with EBA as we were already sort of far along in the study and also with the reference group. But we decided to look at gender because that is a very important part of the study. That should have been a very important part of the study as well. When we went back to the evaluation reports and sort of conducted a sort of search to look for the mention of gender, what came out is that the majority of mentions of gender in those evaluation reports is the evaluator saying there was nothing related to gender in that program. There was no gender strategy, no gender awareness, no gender mainstreaming in the project or program, or there was no gender disaggregated data. So that was the majority of what we could found, basically. So a lot of it was basically not there, mentioning the fact that it was not there. And this actually relates to, programs not being so aware of gender. And another thing to say is that it actually relates to evaluation practice. I mean, we're looking at reports that, I think the most ancient report that we have is from the 1960s. There was obviously nothing related to gender in those reports. So yeah, that sort of like limited our analysis of this. But we have a few pages at the end of the report related to what I just said and what we could find out about gender.
Goncalo, any comments on the questions posed?
Yeah, on the issue of gender, as Raphaëlle said, it was sort of a late addition or a late request, let's say so, because the sort of the screening or the inclusion is very much based on the wording of the 4 SDG 14 targets, and there's not a single word on gender in any of those, and that sort of determined the type of studies that we look for, and that's a consequence of the methodology. So to have we do not wish to claim in any manner that this is representative of gender in fisheries and how it's treated in evaluation or in development cooperation. We would need, what we say, and we write that in the report, we would need to do you could do the same study, but you'd have to start with sort of gender-related search terms and gender-related inclusion criteria, sort of to screen or to select the relevant literature. So let's say we're working with second-best literature with regards to gender here. So I would be very, very cautious about reading much about gender here. Then to the question of developed and developing markets, I'm not really sure I understood what you meant. I could say there's not a word in the studies we've seen on the production of whatever species in well, there's a little bit of floodplain seeding in Bangladesh, but that's it, and that has a very concrete poverty aim, but there's nothing exploring the consequences of fish rearing or fish farming in any countries and the consequences of that for developing countries. But I'm not entirely sure if I got your question right.
I think we need to continue after, because 4 p.m. I think technology is down. So let's continue that discussion over afterward. Now, my final question to all of you. One of our reference group members claimed in one session that had, what we did in the 80s and 90s was a total fiasco in the fisheries aid, if we look retrospect, because then we really put a lot of support to go fish. My question to is now, what is your key recommendation, one key recommendation to policymakers that we should not 30 years from come back? What did we do in the 2019? So I start with David. What is your key recommendation for sustainable aid in fishery sector? And you have the same question, all of you.
Thank you, and thank you for not giving me any time to think about that question.
No, it's this is quick fix.
So I mean, I think one way to sort of come around the issue of industrial versus small scale is to actually look at the outcome, which is the nutrition that will go into human bodies. That's why we're doing it. So I think the aid focus should be on sort of nutritional outcomes from fishing, to maximize those nutritional outcomes. And then in that sense, you would also capture the contribution of artisanal and subsistence fishers to their families' nutritional needs.
Thank you. Kristofer.
Okay. First, I think the guy you referred to, the person you referred to, was wrong. It was fantastically successful, the development aid in those days, because the aim was to build up fleet that could catch lots of fish.
Yes.
In that period, as Tony said, the seas were open, there were high seas, there were no exclusive economic zones, and it was just for the taking, and this was an endless resource. So awesome projects, fantastic. Long-term catastrophe, but at the time, brilliant. And that, now what I think is most important is consistency from the donor community, from governments. Because we're talking here, we all sort of, some of us have a stake in this game, and we're talking, I bragged about the EU's massive amounts of money being given to fisheries, and it's peanuts. It's coffee money compared to sort of big donor programs on almost everything else, transport, what have you. I mean, it's ridiculous how little we spend on this, which is so vital. It's so vital for humankind. Most people live by the coast. Huh? Most people are dependent on this protein, and it's disappearing fast. And the problem is that SIDA, Europe Aid, the World Bank, whatever, there's a handful of people involved in this. They're very engaged, but they're not many. And it's very much dependent on their personalities and their personal interest. And we want consistency from politicians and
consistency of good policies, I guess. Yes. And what other good policies?
That's a tricky question. I would say from a poverty reduction perspective, reduce waste and increase the value or sort of increase the dollar per fish. And that very clearly comes from this study. That was, at least to me, the most exciting finding. That there's probably where you can reconcile poverty reduction with resource conservation, getting more money out of a fish or out of each fish instead of getting more fish out of the sea.
As an economist, I call it value-added perspective. Finally, Raphaëlle.
Okay, well, all great recommendations, but just to say that we won't know if any of them are actually useful unless we improve our evaluation practices and focus on documenting what doesn't work as well as what actually works.
Good, thanks a lot. And having listened to you, also studied this, your report, and also being part of the reference group, to me, I think, I guess we all less agree on that management governance is key. Irrespective if you speak about small scale or large scale, or maybe I should phrase it subsistence fishing or fishing as a way of making a living, the institutional aspects I think is also part of this game. So thanks a lot, panelists, authors, all of you. Before we leave, I will ask Marcus or Mats to tell us, because it's my script, tell us when next seminar is, and I forgot that. You have it on your mind.
No, may I have a second last word?
Yes,
I would just like to thank Mats and Eba for the opportunity to do this study. Obviously, thank the team, thank the reference group. It's been a very interesting journey these 1.5 years. So it's been really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mats. Yeah, a big hand for authors and the panel.
We always thank you so much for. It's been really a pleasure to work with this team. I can tell you, my learning curve has been so steep. We always end seminars by telling what will be the next one. But this time we don't have any next one here in Stockholm decided. There will be a seminar in Sarajevo. There will be one in Phnom Penh where we present EBA studies to audiences in those countries. There will probably be some seminar in December on the DDB, the dissertation, development dissertation briefs, as newly published PhDs, where we organize seminars around these. And then in January, we'll be back with new seminars. So keep an eye on the www.eba.se website, where you will learn about the next seminar. And welcome.
Thank you.